Riley Brady, at long last, welcome to the Freetrail podcast. Thanks for doing this.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me, Dylan.
Yeah, and we were just talking about how I was overly ambitious in trying to schedule this while I was in New Zealand. So we've both had an opportunity to recover. In your case, from a dominating 30-minute course record win at Black Canyon, and in my case, talking about trail running. We are fully recovered and ready to talk more about trail running. And I always start these conversations in the same place, Riley. So I have to get your contribution here. That opening question that I ask everybody is, what makes you, when you are being introspective? What makes Riley Brady a unique person on planet Earth?
Yeah, I think I have to go with the anthropologist answer here. I studied anthropology in undergrad, and I just think that, it's who you're surrounded by, your culture. I'm sure genes play a role in there too. But I really think that, the people who have raised me are first and foremost there. And then like who I continue to surround myself with. All really important, I think, in shaping who I am now. That's the anthropologist in me that I can't quite shake.
Awesome. So we'll build off that in a little bit, but I spoke to your friend Ellie Pell today, and she made a comment that I thought was really interesting, and that you guys both moved to Boulder around the same time, I think a couple of years ago. And she said that this was effectively, in maybe both of your cases, but especially for you, at least this is how she presented it, was that it was an expression of you taking a deeper commitment to your athleticism, to your running career, and, quote unquote, moving to Boulder to try and make it as an athlete. And I would love to just have you take us back in time to that moment, because, especially with the context of these huge back-to-back victories that you've had and that we'll talk about, I think it would be fun to revisit that moment in your life. So tell us about the moment of moving to Boulder and where you were at mentally and as it relates to your career.
Yeah. So it had always been in the back of my mind that I kind of wanted to come and check out Boulder. Pretty much since I got into trail running in college. Back when I was in school, I think Boulder and Flagstaff were the two kind of main trail running hubs that were on my radar. And just, life kind of happens. And when I was in my mid-20s and thinking about where do I want to be? Like, what do I want to be doing? I was applying to some grad schools, and then all of a sudden COVID hit. And so all of those things just kind of got shut down. Like any chance of moving, that just did not seem like the time. And I actually was living at home with my parents during COVID, which I am very grateful for. I'm glad I wasn't trapped in an apartment alone or, any of these other kind of less than ideal situations that a lot of people had to live with. But anyway, when COVID kind of started to retreat, I was like, all right, I can't shake this thought of going to Boulder. I need to just take that leap and do it, give it a try. And if I don't like it, I can leave, I can go back. And then I got here and I was like, I'm never leaving. This is the best. And so I think the things that a lot of people will point to in a town like Boulder is, you're at altitude, you have access to the trails, and all that stuff is great. Like having access to resources is definitely helpful. But for me, I think the biggest difference has been just having a much stronger community, people who want to do the things that I want to do, having training partners and running buddies. That's just been so important to me. It just means I'm happy generally in life. And I think that when you're happy, that feeds into your running, and they kind of work together.
Okay, so there's two things I want to expand on as it relates to that answer. Number one, I just had Claire Gallagher on the podcast a couple of weeks ago, and she made the comment that in her own running and training, she's experienced sort of a second wind based on the people that she's been surrounding herself with. And it feels to me as if I think one of those people she was referencing was you. And so I think it would be fun to just like have you say a little bit more about that group of people that you're training with there in Boulder and to what extent that's been part of you sort of taking your game to the next level.
Yeah, I mean, I love Claire. She's hilarious and smart and just so fun to be around. And I'm sure she probably mentioned it, but we run in a group with a few other friends like Catherine, Sophie, Chelsea, Abby. Um, Typically Sundays are when we all get a chance to get together and our schedules kind of line up. But yeah, that group has just been super fun to share miles with and hang out with outside of running. And then I have other friends that I run with during the week. It's just like there's so many people here who you want to spend time with and who just like, I don't even know if it's like push. I mean, I'm sure we're pushing each other in workouts and stuff like that, but it's really just like the joy of being able to hang out with people while you're running, you know?
Yeah, but do you feel as if this group, this environment, this community is part of the reason why, at least to a lot of us fans of yours, it feels like Riley Brady has arrived in a new category of athlete?
Yeah, definitely. Like when I'm racing, like I'm thinking about my friends. Like I'm thinking about conversations we've had. I'm like thinking about amazing things that they've done. Like I'm 100% drawing on them for inspiration when I'm out there on a race course.
Yeah. Okay. So then other thing I wanted to have you expand on here that you just sort of mentioned, you being in what it seems like a happy moment in life and comfortable in your new home, your new adopted home of Boulder, where you've been for a couple of years. Ellie Pell made the diagnosis that you just feel very at peace right now, which I thought was a pretty interesting thing to say. A close friend of yours sort of making that characterization of you herself. So to what extent do you agree with Ellie Pell about you being quote unquote at peace? And does being at peace and the feeling of just being in this happy, supportive environment, has that been part of the success that you've had recently?
Yeah, I definitely think so. I mean, I think, you know, running is fun, but it's also stress. And so if you have a bunch of different sources of stress in your life, like that all starts to add up. And I think, yeah, I'm at the point where I'm like, you know, I'm not stressed by any of my interpersonal relationships. Like that's just like a really big source of joy for me. And so, yeah, I think being at peace, at least in my like day-to-day life, is an accurate characterization. I do think with like some of the current executive orders, I have been pretty upset by a lot of that stuff. But you know, it's kind of like two separate pieces. Like I can take a step back from that if I need to. And that's, you know, a function of me being lucky in where I am and who I'm with and feeling really well supported, that some of those measures aren't going to be affecting me on a day-to-day basis the way they're going to affect other people, even if I find that intellectually abhorrent and really upsetting.
Yeah. Well, thanks for sharing that. So being at peace, irrespective of the political dynamic, and we don't need to go deeper into that, but I think that it can't be overstated how important that is, especially if you then look back at what the results have been for you, this massive 30-minute course record. I think those sorts of transformative performances and life experiences do need to be built on top of a foundation of personal harmony and peace. And I don't think that's always obvious to fans of sport, you know, and that being happy and feeling good about where you are in life has a massive implication on how you perform on the race course. So
totally
fun to talk about that a little bit. So I'm cognizant that we'll also be sort of introducing you a little bit more to a lot of the Freetrail audience. And so I do like to do some background work, and I don't know that much about you. So I'm just excited to just learn a little bit more. Of course, like a lot of trail running fans who make our way around the country and around the world to various races. I've come to know your parents who travel to support you pretty much every single time you race. I know you grew up in Pennsylvania, but aside from knowing your parents and knowing that fact, I'd love to just learn a little bit more about, what your childhood was like and, at what point sport became part of your identity.
Yeah. I was always active as a kid. Like my parents were very much the like, yeah, you can go play outside parents. They didn't really sign us up for a lot of organized sports until we were older. I do think it's a bit unique that I grew up without TV. So like we didn't have that. So it was like, yeah, play outside or read. So that was pretty good chunk of my childhood. I have a younger brother, so we'd play together, throw the frisbee, ride bikes. Yeah, nothing too crazy. And then in high school, I had a phenomenal cross country coach, who I credit him with really getting me into running, and instilling this love of running. It was not a pressure cooker environment by any stretch of the imagination. It was, our school was not competitive at all. But it sowed those seeds for me to be able to keep running as a lifelong pursuit, I think, which is just, yeah, I'm really grateful to Peter for doing that when I was in high school. And then when I got to college, so my high school was pretty academically challenging. I was very focused on school. I was really intent on being top of my class in high school. And then when I got to college, it was just very easy in comparison, at least off the bat. You just
academically, you mean?
Academically, yeah. I mean, just in terms of time, college, like you're taking 4 classes instead of 8. And like they were giving me approximately the same amount of work as my classes in high school were. So all of a sudden I had half the work to do. So I was like, well, I guess I'll just run in the woods on the back of campus. There was like probably like a 1/4-mile loop. I had a Timex watch at the time, so I don't know how long it was. But I just go like run that loop over and over and over again. And eventually figured out like, oh, like running a really long time is a sport that people do. My friend wanted to do Cayuga Trails 50. She was from Ithaca. And at the time you needed a qualifier, either a 50K or a marathon under a certain time. So we kind of scrambled and I looked around and found the New Jersey Ultra Fest, which was just like a looped course. Nothing too exciting, but the timing was right. It was close to where I grew up. So I was like, all right, I'm signing up for this 50K so I can get my qualifier to run Cayuga Trails 50 mile. And I think after those 2 races, I was hooked. I was like, yep, running's what I'm going to do, but I'm just going to keep running.
I want to talk more about that in a second because I've done Cayuga Trails too. That's a fantastic race on the East Coast.
Such a great race. 2
things that seem related to me. You've now mentioned your academics a couple of times, with the anthropology answer at the beginning and now here, as you talked about high school and college. And then you also mentioned that your parents didn't allow you to watch TV. And those two things are probably related, right? When you don't have the hours of mindless time-sucking television observation when you're a kid, you probably have a lot of time and energy and interest to pour into other things like your academics. So tell me about your parents' philosophy against television when you were a kid and how that maybe impacted this academic path you were on.
Yeah, I don't know if it was like really a philosophical choice. I think they were just like, we don't want to pay for cable. Like that just seems like a waste of money. So they just didn't. And I ended up reading a lot of books instead.
It's funny. My wife and I have this conversation fairly often because we have a young son now, and we came from very different backgrounds. My wife came from a family where they were never allowed to watch television. I came from a family where I would wake up every morning and turn on ESPN and just watch sports stuff for hours and hours every single day and then spend all weekend watching football and sports and stuff. And one of the great things she brought into my life was like, just not spending so much time in front of a television. And I just think it's interesting, especially now as a father, thinking about how those decisions end up impacting kids in the direction of their entire life. And obviously a lot of those hours that I spent watching ESPN have translated into me now being a podcaster, but also it was my wife not having that influence has made her the interesting and wonderful person that she is. And so anyway, that's a fun thing to just think about here, especially now that I know your parents well. The other thing that I know about you is that you're a bike mechanic. So I heard from Ellie that you had recently left your job to focus more on running, but tell me about your history with the bike.
Yeah. So after college, I actually biked down the West Coast with two of my friends, which was my first like big bike tour. I think we were on the road for 2.5 months that summer, which was just such an awesome experience. Like I didn't know anything about bikes really before that. I learned how to fix my first flat on the side of a highway with a thunderstorm rolling in. My bike upside down and like all the bags on the bike. But figured it out. And after that, I kind of didn't know what I wanted to do with my life and it was in the back of my mind, like, being a bike mechanic might be kind of cool. And ended up, there were a couple bike shops that were hiring, actually right before COVID hit. And I applied and got hired. They were like, yep, we're willing to train. This was at Trek in Pennsylvania. And then I immediately got an email saying, stand by, everything is shut down. Like, we'll let you know. And fortunately, we were deemed an essential business and they opened back up. And so I worked in person through all of COVID. My experience was very different, I think, from most people's. But it also meant I got a ton of experience working on bikes very quickly. Like, bikes boomed during COVID. We just could not keep up with demand at all. We were drowning, completely understaffed. But it was like sink or swim. And I got thrown a lot of projects that were, more advanced, I think, than most beginner mechanics would get the opportunity to work on. So I got a pretty cool crash course, I think. And then was able to kind of transfer with Trek when I moved out to Boulder. And even though I really like my coworkers, like the shop, it was taking away kind of too much from my running at the time. And I kind of had reached a point where, I wasn't getting to do a lot of the cool projects. I felt like I was kind of plateauing a little bit in terms of being able to learn new stuff. So I took my leave, said it's time for me to go.
I want to come back to that in a second because it feels like that's a big decision and maybe part of this, massive run of success that you've been on recently too. But just thinking about being a bike mechanic and the importance of that job, as it relates especially to like professional racing and stuff. I know a lot of top pros have a mechanic on staff. Obviously all the top teams do. And then obviously they're massively important to like any community too. Like every town needs to have a bike shop that needs to have competent mechanics. And it just feels like bike mechanics are sort of unsung heroes in life in some ways. So maybe you could comment on that, but also just the value of working with your hands. And I know you said in your Chasing Gold interview with Skylar that you're into metalwork. So I wondered if maybe that was part of your experience being a bike mechanic and this metalwork, the intersection of art and function. So maybe you could just respond to any of those things that might be interesting.
Yeah, I'll try to cover all of that. Yeah, I mean, I definitely think bike mechanics serve an important role in the community, especially for people who are using bikes for transportation. Like, that's why I like bikes. Like, I think they are such a cool tool for getting around. They're so efficient and you actually really can carry a bunch of stuff on them for very little effort. race bikes are kind of a different category, especially now with electronic shifting and stuff like that. That's not really why I fell in love with bikes, and I have a lot of opinions about electronic shifting.
Okay.
But yes, the metalwork piece definitely has stemmed from being a bike mechanic. That's how I got interested in bicycle frame building. That was kind of my door into that world.
I wonder if you're like, welding frames together.
I'm not quite at that point. I took a class in Canada 2 years ago-ish for frame building, and it was an awesome experience. I still have not technically finished that frame. I need to file down my fillets. I just don't have shop space to be doing that, unfortunately. But yeah, long-term goal, get better at welding, get better at frame building. I'd like to get there one day.
So cool. All right. So tell me about leaving your job. Obviously that's a big decision to make, but I think what makes it more interesting in your case, and that was part of this big conversation around Black Canyon, is like Riley Brady's not sponsored. And I know you're a coach too, but you left your job at the bike shop without the backing of a major corporate brand, probably in service of your running career. So tell us about that moment and any internal friction that was occurring at the time.
Yeah. I'm definitely taking a chance right now and just kind of hoping that sponsorship is going to work out eventually, hopefully in the near future rather than too late. I maybe didn't have as much internal friction as I should have around that. I was just like, it's time for me to go. I'll figure something out. If I run out of money, I can always come back. I can get a different job. It seemed like the right move.
Does it say anything about who you are as a person? Because when I asked Ellie Pell about it, what she said was that it's just sort of, it was a kind of a Riley Brady thing to do, not taking the safe route and betting on yourself. Has that kind of been a hallmark of your personality?
I don't know. I feel like I'm in a lucky position to be able to do that. Like I said, I lived with my parents during COVID. So I was able to save money at that point in my life, which then, lets me do what I'm doing now, maybe with less stress around that decision. Yeah, I don't know how to respond to that question.
Okay, so we'll just take Ellie's word for it. I don't know. I think it is a brave move, and clearly it's paid off. Not to the degree that at least you're making public announcements about new sponsorships, but obviously the proof is in the pudding on the race course for Riley Brady. We're going to talk about that in a little bit. And as we move towards talking about recent racing, I was just going back and reviewing things that you've done in your career, and you've been in the sport for much longer than I realized. You referenced that first 50K that you did. That was back in 2014. So coming up on 11 years in the sport. You're not even 30 yet. So especially now with this context of Javelina, Black Canyon, we're going to start looking ahead towards Western States. And you're actually a lot more experienced than I realized personally, and that I think a lot of our listeners will appreciate too. Are there things that you look back on now with where you are in your career that you view as like major inflection point moments in your journey as an athlete?
I do think that getting a coach after Bandera, I don't remember what year that was, a couple years back. That was right before I got my first golden ticket at Javelina. That felt like a big kind of jump up for me. Obviously before that I'd been doing pretty well at local events, but that was my first success on a major, national race. And then I do think, since moving to Boulder, I've had a little bit of an adjustment period, but it feels like finally the pieces have kind of fallen into place. And yeah, I've had a good, at least last couple of months.
So, but looking back, you don't, I mean, because it seems like you were successful from the beginning and just sort of steadily putting together solid regional results. And then, yeah, as you mentioned, Javelina's sort of like, I guess you could view that as a major inflection point moment. Winning a golden ticket for any athlete is an inflection point. Moving to Boulder, getting connected with a good coach. Yeah, I don't know. Are there any things that are on the opposite side of the spectrum where it was like a major moment of adversity that feels like an inflection point in retrospect?
Yeah, I mean, I think when people first started pushing the high carb fueling and like really having more of an emphasis on nutrition, I really took a step back because I grew up in the sport in the era of people really weren't fueling. There really wasn't that much information. Like I'm watching videos of Killian prancing off into the mountains saying, I'm bringing 2 Snickers bars. um, and like, I didn't know anything. So I like wasn't really eating. I was drinking water mostly at races. And so then when this nutrition revolution started to take off, I was like, oh, I should really be paying attention to my carb intake, my salt intake, like trying to get these up to where they should be. And that was kind of around the time that I ran Western States the first time, and just had a terrible day out there, just so much puking. And that kind of kicked off a year and change long puking party at all of my races until I could really figure out that nutrition piece and just realize that I am an outlier. And so a lot of those standard rules just, I don't think apply to me. And it took me some time to kind of come back from that setback. And Black Canyon, I think, really confirmed that for me, that I have figured out what works. Javelina went really well, but I wanted to confirm it at a second race. And I feel like I feel much more confident now in my fueling.
It's interesting. So I'm sure a lot of people would love to hear you expand on that. So you mentioned in the Chasing Gold series that at Javelina you were doing like 45 grams of carbs an hour. Obviously, everybody's talking about 90 to 120. I am fully indoctrinated myself. I ran a 50K last weekend where I was doing 100 grams an hour. Granted, I've never been slower in my life and I need every advantage I can possibly get. But I would love to have you just say, as someone who has at least temporarily discovered what works, because we'll all acknowledge that it is a moving target. And as soon as you feel like you've figured it out, something might
totally
change. What is working for you and how is it different from this, common knowledge that's in the zeitgeist right now?
Yeah. So I will say that the 45 grams per hour at Javelina, I am trying to get that up from there. That was a little bit just by necessity of how that course access to crew and relying on aid stations and stuff like that. So I think really trying to be closer to that 60 grams of carbs per hour is what's going to be the sweet spot for me. But the sodium, I think, has also been a key point for me in terms of I'm just an extreme outlier there. Like I basically don't need salt when I run. And so I think figuring that out and realizing like, yeah, targeting average numbers for that just does not work for me. That was a really key piece of information.
How did you learn that?
I took a sweat test and it came back that I was in the first percentile for low sodium loss. And I was like, this can't be right. So then I took another sweat test and it confirmed that.
What's so funny is I'm just returning home from Tarawera, and at Tarawera, Lottie Branks was late to our pre-race interview because she was getting a sodium concentration assessment in her sweat, and that she's on the opposite side of the spectrum. Basically, they were shocked by her results in that, and basically she discovered she needs to supplement more with salt. Maybe this is the next thing that everybody's going to discover as part of their nutrition strategies.
And it's so individual. Like, I do think it's worth getting tested, like just to get a ballpark, of where you are. Like your body's flexible. It'll figure it out within to a certain degree.
Yeah.
But having a sense of your starting point, I think is not a bad thing.
So does that mean you went from supplementing with electrolyte drinks and salt pills to basically not supplementing at all?
Yeah, I mean, I have a little bit, but I use the precision carb only drink mix because it's one of the few drink mixes that I don't have to worry about like there being too much sodium in there because there's no sodium. I can just add it as needed, essentially.
Wow, super interesting. Thanks for sharing. Speaking about your training a little bit more too, you don't post everything on Strava, I don't think, just going back and perusing myself, but you work with David Roche, and I spoke to him and he said that, you've basically just been steadily getting better and better every year. He did say that fueling has sort of been your biggest recent unlock. So maybe you could share a little bit about the dynamic between you and David and how you guys have worked together to sort of have these couple breakthroughs that you've had recently.
Yeah. I think, having David in my corner is hugely beneficial. He really knows what he's doing with training. And I feel like he's really ramped up the workouts that he's given me in the past couple of years. Like these are like big kid workouts that I'm doing.
Give us an example because you don't publish everything. We got to hear.
I publish most of my workouts, I think. I mean, obviously the classic is like 16 by 1-1. And then recently has been adding, moderate running at the end of that. Now that I'm on the spot, I like can't think of workouts that I'm doing. But yeah, I mean, part of not publishing everything on Strava, honestly, is just that I have it set to private for all of my uploads. And sometimes I just forget to like come up with a title and unprivate.
Well, I was going back and looking at your block before Black Canyon. I'm like, oh, Riley did 38 miles. I was like, no way. No way Riley ran 38 miles that week.
I intentionally hid my course preview weekend. Yeah, I did not publish that one.
Okay. I want to ask you about that a little bit later, but maybe just sticking on the training, is there anything, I mean, as I look at your career, right, it's been solid, steady, you're in the mix and the golden ticket conversation at a lot of the races that you've done. And then bam, back to back, just monster victories at Javelina and Black Canyon. So the thing that I'm curious about when you see that sort of step change in results is like, what was the training that led to that? So if there's anything that you guys were doing differently, obviously a lot of improvement just comes with consistency over time. So maybe that's the answer, but I'm sure the audience would be curious.
Yeah, I really think it's the nutrition piece for me. Like the training was not drastically different. Like I think I've honestly had the fitness to be doing better than I have been over the past couple of years. Like the fitness has been there. It's just that I have been unable to stop throwing up. So like once I was able to stop throwing up all the time, all of a sudden I was able to run to my fitness level. But yeah, the training is just, I've been just doing it for 10 years now, you know?
So the nutrition is the major element that's led to
Yeah, that is the biggest thing by far that has changed.
All right, sweet. Well, we will continue to monitor that Strava account, and maybe there's more information we can glean in the future. But thanks for sharing that. I want to just, we don't have time to go back and analyze all your race results, but I'd love to just like speak specifically about Javelina and Black Canyon, the two most recent things before we look forward to Western States. Javelina was your third time there. You've had solid runs each time, though this was certainly the best one. And when I talked to David, he said something that was interesting. I have to say, I was there crewing and pacing for Hannah Allgood, who finished second behind you. So I got to watch your whole race. So very, very impressed. But what David said is that you were actually not totally satisfied with that race, that you felt that sub 14 was realistic. You finished, I think, at 14:19. So I'm personally curious to hear you share a little bit about your post-race assessment, that conversation with David, and how you were grading yourself.
Yeah, I mean, I was really happy to win and get my ticket, but I really was hoping to run sub 14, and I do still think that's realistic. it was obviously a historically hot year at Javelina. And I think cooling just takes time, and you have to take that time if you want to make it to the end. So I don't want to sound like ungrateful that I walked away with a win and a ticket. But I definitely had, going into that, I had my sights set on, sub 14 time wise. And I think I'm not going to go back this year, but eventually I will be going back because I really want to run a fast 100.
So that's interesting to hear you say that, right? Like that going sub 14 would indicate a course record at Javelina. Of course, we know you obliterated the course record at Black Canyon. Can you talk a bit about that goal setting process as you go into these races, like how you evaluate where your fitness is at relative to historically fast times? Are you just the type of person that sets really ambitious targets like that?
Yeah, I think I just set unreasonable targets. I'm like you just like target something under course record pace and like hope that if you miss, you're close enough, I think also I'm looking at training and like long runs and what paces feel comfortable on similar terrain. So it's not totally just a shot in the dark, but I just, when I was young in this sport, like, yeah, I set really unreasonable goals, and then I would surprise myself by like hitting that goal or sometimes surpassing that goal, or even falling short and getting close to it. And I think I learned like, oh, well, yeah, just shoot high, see what happens, like you really, what's the worst that happens? We're just out here running.
I love it, and that's the only way that you end up having those big transcendent breakthroughs like you had at Black Canyon only a few months later. Before we get to that though, speaking specifically about getting the golden ticket at Javelina for the second time, there's not a lot of athletes over history who've been able to earn multiple golden tickets. I'd have to go back and do like a deep analysis, but it means that you've been very consistent. And I think what would be interesting to hear you talk about is how that changes the psychology and the planning once that's secured, because then you can just know, okay, Western States is on in June, pressure's off a little bit more. And it may even influence the way you and David approach the training through the winter months. Is there anything there that would be interesting?
Yeah, I mean, I do think that was hugely beneficial to me at Black Canyon, to just not be going into it with the pressure of a ticket. Like you said, getting your ticket in the fall is great. You get to sit back and watch the rest of Golden Ticket season unfolds. Like, you're in, and you can decide if you want to line up at more Golden Ticket races or not. You kind of have a little bit more freedom and wiggle room. And I think can take a little bit more risk in training. Like you said, that might mean doing some higher volume weeks. Whereas if you're like really trying to play it safe and walk that line with it because you've got a ticket in mind, like that might limit some people. From a mindset perspective, it was very helpful going into Black Canyon. I was like, I don't have anything to lose, I have my ticket.
Yeah. Okay. Well, let's get to Black Canyon in a sec. It's just dawning on me that before we move off Javelina, it'd be fun to hear you talk about the fact that you and David both won the race. Your coach, David, crushed the men's race. You, of course, won and ran, I think, the second fastest time ever at Javelina. So even though you didn't go sub 14, still massively successful for the two of you. Were there any fun conversations in the aftermath or high fives exchanged where you guys got to gloat about your amazing accomplishments together?
I think that the day after, we're both like hobbling over to the podium with the same little 100-mile shuffle walk.
Yeah. It must be pretty cool though, to share that with your coach, right?
Yeah, it's awesome. Like, on our pre-race call, like, obviously David's my coach. So he's like, hyping me up and telling me what my strengths are. And I'm like giving him info about the course. Cause I'm like, I've been out here twice before. Like, this is what you need to know. So it was much more of like a two-way call, I would say, because we were both getting ready to race, which
so
was
you were
cool.
coaching him up too. So he owes it all to you. Okay. He owes it all to Riley.
I would not say that.
Yeah. We're teasing. So cool. All right. Well, let's spend the rest of our time talking about Black Canyon and looking ahead towards Western States. You just mentioned it, but you did a course preview run or like some kind of a training camp on the course. In that conversation you had with Skylar, you were intentionally cagey with the details. I don't know if you want to reveal any of them to me here, although I would love to hear. But more generally, just like taking that extra step, a race you'd already done multiple times at that point, to go out and do a training camp on the course, what value it had to the performance.
Yeah, so that was hugely beneficial. I think getting out there right before the race, it's hard to remember a course when you're racing it, and it was a year ago, sometimes more. So just being able to take my time a little bit more and, note key turns, and it's just fresher in your mind. I will say that was not always the plan. My longest training weekend just happened to coincide with the snowpocalypse in Boulder. It was like supposed to be negative temperatures and a snowstorm. And I was like, I am not running 50K in this on Saturday. I managed to get a last minute trip out to Arizona planned. And I'm very grateful I did, because it was, it was confidence boosting, and just getting to see the terrain and make sure it's right in your brain. It was more helpful, I think, than I even knew at the time.
Were you solo? Was this a solo training camp?
My dad actually came out and crewed me. Best parents ever.
Yes. Go, Bill. Are you still reluctant to share details of it? Because I'm sure the audience would be really interested. I mean, you just sort of teased the fact that you were supposed to do a 50K. So you probably did about a 50K on the course. Was it a multi-day block?
So I did 32 miles on Saturday, starting at Black Canyon City, running backwards on the course a little bit, and then running to the finish line. I had a couple little wrong turns in there. Like I was having to navigate. Obviously the course isn't marked. There was like one point where there was a big sign that said trail closed. And I was like, oh, all right, I guess I can't go this way. And ended up coming back to it and realizing that the sign in tiny letters said 2 motor vehicles. It's like, you couldn't have led with that. Come on.
Yeah.
So anyway, mostly went smoothly. But I ended up, that split was not far off Rachel Drake's, from last year, for that section of the course. And I was like, okay, I was having to navigate, and I was just like running easy, not pushing it. So that was like, okay, I feel good about that. And then I did, like 13 or 14 or so miles, on Sunday. And that was from Gloriana Mine, to Black Canyon City. And I think maybe I added a little on, I don't quite remember, but it was a solid weekend. And it was hopping off a 100-mile week. So I was like, yeah, I think I'm ready. I think we're good.
I'm just reminding myself now too, that last year, one of the things that Hayden said that stuck out to me after his course record victory was that he had done a little course recon weekend where he had actually done simulated crew transitions at the aid stations. And so anyway, that's now, a trend, I guess. Both Hayden Hawks, Riley Brady putting together course record runs with some course reconnaissance in there. And I think as the sport continues to get more competitive, more advanced, doing those little things, even though you had completed the race multiple times at that point, to have the refresher, to have the course really downloaded in the front of your brain prior to stepping to the start line, definitely massively valuable. You also said in your conversation with Skylar that you were following historical splits, which I interpreted to be Keeley's course record splits from 2023. And in all the photos, you can see splits written on your arm. So of course it makes me want to ask you, Mary Denholm, of course, took the race out really hot. I think you passed her right before Gloriana Mine aid station. That was like roughly mile 23 or 24 or something like that. And I'd love to just have you comment on that, because obviously you're well under the splits that are written on your arm. Like how does that impact your psychology, or like how do you balance sticking with the front of the race versus sticking to your splits?
Yeah, I always feel like I race better when I am running my own race, as opposed to just like latching on to whoever's going off the front fastest. But in the case of Black Canyon, I had looked at multiple winners of previous years, splits to kind of get a range beyond just what Keeley ran for the course record. And I did my homework well enough that I actually never ended up looking at the splits that I had written on my arm. I didn't even look at my watch actually until Table Mesa aid station. So
what?
Like when I came to the
mile 50?
Yeah.
You were locked in, Riley. You were so locked
I was
in.
Just running on vibes. I was like, I am just going to feel this out. Yeah, when Mary went off the front at the beginning, I was pretty confident I was going to see her later in the day. Yeah, so it wasn't until Table Mesa that I looked down and saw I was at 6:42, and I knew that previous winners had done that last stretch in like an hour and 40-ish minutes. And I was like, okay, if I'm under 2 hours, like I'm under course record. So yeah, that was the first time I actually looked at the watch.
Wow, that's incredible. So you I guess probably didn't have a realization of just how historical or how remarkable of a day you were having.
I had no idea
No
until
way.
I crossed the finish line.
Oh, that's crazy.
Even looking at my watch at Table Mesa, I couldn't do that math. I was like, okay, I know I'm under course record, but I thought it was going to be like 5 minutes under course record because I just like, my brain wasn't firing on all cylinders.
Oh my God, Riley, this is incredible. What a story. Okay. So it makes me want to ask you too, you said in that conversation with Skylar that earlier in your career, you liked to come from behind, but that you were realizing more and more now that that's just not possible in the modern era. And so I'd love to hear if that impacted race strategy at all, because obviously, even if you weren't looking at the splits, you knew Mary was ahead of you for that first third of the race. And was it just that you didn't want to let her go?
Yeah. I mean, I think I just have gotten less afraid of going out harder. I just have more confidence in my ability to maintain those higher efforts. And so even though I knew Mary was ahead of me, I was like, if she can hold that, like amazing, like she fully deserves the win. Like that will be a spectacular day. But I also know that I can just kind of like dance downhills. And so I was going to be working those all day. And I just was, I had confidence that if you go out, not easy, I'm not jogging those first couple of miles, but as long as you're kind of, staying within yourself, but running hardish. I'm not articulating this well, but,
no, I like it. Yeah.
It sort of that comfortably hard effort, I guess, is a good way to say it. And then just having confidence in myself that like, I know I can maintain this all day. And if Mary can do that, great. But like, I was hoping to catch her, obviously.
Right. So maybe take us into the moment of passing Mary. Like I said, I think it was probably mile 23 or 24. It was captured beautifully on film. I don't know if you've had a chance to revisit it, but it was still pretty early and ended up being the definitive move. Did it feel like that at the time?
No. Mm-hmm. I was just running. I was like singing my songs, was really surprised to see Mary up ahead. I was like, oh, I guess she slowed down a little bit. And actually, when I passed her, I was like, stick with me. Like, come on, like, let's work this together. But yeah, I was just like vibing, having fun, doing my thing. Was not like trying to put a move on. I was just running.
Yeah. All right. So you were vibing, and I'd love for you to say a bit about your mindset because of course you're well under course record pace, even if you didn't understand that, the rest of us did. And I got to see you in a couple of places and chase you with a GoPro a couple of times. In fact, I still have some cool footage of that I got to share with you. I'm sure we'll put it up on our account at some point. But at Deep Canyon Ranch specifically, I ran out of the aid station with you with the camera, and you had your headphones in. You're literally singing on the course. And I don't know, it just, again, going back to, the beginning of our conversation here, you just felt at peace, in the same way that Ellie Pell has described you in that way in your personal life. So maybe you could just take us into your brain and between your ears during the race, and whether or not, I don't know. Because to me, it just felt like it was really smooth, and your behavior, was just a reflection of your internal state.
Yeah, I think music really helps with that for me. I actually don't love start lines being crowded in with that many people. And often there's loud music and like flashing camera lights, and that kind of all stresses me out a little bit. But I realized that if I just have my headphones in, I can kind of focus on whatever I'm listening to. And that just helps keep me a little bit calmer from the start. And then I carry that through for the duration of the race. Like I just, keep listening to my music. And the singing thing, like it just gets me outside of my head. Like you can't spiral when you're singing your favorite songs. Like you have to focus on the lyrics. Like it's just, it just stops that mental process, I think. So even though it sounds bad, probably it's not good singing. It just kind of helps me maintain that calm, I think, throughout the day.
You can't have a negative internal dialogue when you've got an audible external singing voice. Okay.
Exactly.
Learn something on every episode here. Awesome. So eventually you get to the finish line, 30-minute CR. I mean, what was your reaction there? I mean, do you think you would have been running slower had you been monitoring your splits?
Maybe. I think I could have been running slower if I was going after a ticket. I think I would have run with more fear, but I just kept, whenever I questioned how fast I was going, I was like, but you have nothing to lose. So like, why not?
Yeah.
And then getting to the finish line, that was when I realized how far under course record I was. And I was, I'm happy, but also finish lines, like now you're getting whisked away to doping control. Like you're like, what just happened?
You walked right past me and I was like, Riley, will you please come on my podcast?
Yes.
Like I got something to attend to here. Okay. Like,
yeah.
You freaking nerd, get out of here. But that's interesting to hear you say that of like, yeah, if you didn't have this nothing to lose attitude, maybe you would have been playing things a little bit more tactically. And yeah, of course, the reality is, having executed in the way that you did, I mean, that's like one of the great performances. I mean, yeah, we're seeing records come down at every race, including at Tarawera last weekend too. But, like in the men's race, for example, Seth broke Hayden's record by 5 minutes. You lowered the women's record by 30 minutes. It's just like a monster margin. And so anyway, it's interesting to investigate just all the different details that could have contributed to that, your mindset, the lack of looking at your watch and just, coming in and, feeling like you have nothing to lose. Really, really interesting. Anything else you want to expand on there?
I don't think so. I think we pretty much covered it.
Okay, cool. One thing that David said that I think would be interesting to have you comment on too is let's talk about the recovery for a second. What he said is that when you've done something that nobody has, that it's unpredictable how your body and mind might respond in the aftermath. So maybe you could tell us how you felt in the week or two after Black Canyon.
Yeah, I've actually been feeling pretty good. I took about 5 days totally off running. Had a couple little walks in there, but like nothing that I would consider like an exercise session,
Yeah.
and just kind of listen to my body and what I want to do. And so for the first few days, I was just sitting on the couch and eating a lot. And then I started to get antsy and brought in a couple little walks. And then did a couple little jogs. I had a little bit of low hamstring tightness. So switched to cross training the next day, just a little bit of time on the bike. And then I actually participated in a study today and did a lactate threshold test this morning. So that was a little bit harder running. And yeah, my body felt really good. I didn't feel like I was at peak fitness. Definitely was working harder for paces that normally aren't so hard, but I've been really happily surprised with the fact that I just feel like I'm bouncing back.
Gosh, Riley. So awesome. So exciting. So let's point our gaze towards Western States, which is now about 4 months away. You finished 14th in 2023.
Yep.
It's a tough go by your admission. And Ellie said that it was, mostly nutrition related too. So would love to just kind of hear what the next 4 months look like for you. I mean, obviously we can take it in any number of different ways, what the focus is going to be when you come back to training, how you maybe mitigate mistakes that you made in 2023 where you might be racing again. Any of those things would be fun to talk about.
Yeah. So I think from a training perspective, probably not going to do a ton different. Might be a little bit higher volume this year going into it, but really the nutrition is the big piece for me. So I think having that figured out or mostly figured out going into States, that's going to be the big difference. Hopefully on race day. I've told Craig I am not going to throw up all over his course this year, and I really hope to keep that promise.
Famous last words. We'll see about that. So cool. Go ahead. Yeah.
Yeah, I forget the second part of your question there. So,
well, yeah, if there's anything that you might use as a tune-up between now and States, I'm sure people would be interested.
Yeah, I am considering canyons if they'll let me in. They have been very cagey about letting people in. So we'll see if I can get in. And I'm kind of just waiting to see how I fully bounce back from Black Canyon, how this recovery goes before I really make the final decision on that.
Cool. One thing I'd love to have you comment on too, and that I talked to Dan Jones about just a couple days ago when I was in New Zealand after his incredible 100K victory at Tarawera, was like, being fit too early is a thing, like being too fit too early. And so obviously you've got a great coach and you clearly have a good sense of your own body and your own capabilities, but is that something that you've thought about? Clearly your fitness is there, right? So like, how do you preserve the stoke, preserve the energy so you don't end up showing up fried in June?
Yeah. I mean, I think I am just a very consistent runner. Like, I don't think I have these like big peaks and valleys with my fitness. Like, I basically don't get injured. So I'm able to stack like really consistent training time and time again. I recover very quickly after these events. So yeah, I can kind of like jump back into things and I don't feel like it has a huge negative impact. These could be famous last words, like, we'll see what happens this summer. But I just think that my trajectory is just like bit by bit. I have just been like climbing these stairs, stacking the bricks, and I just kind of keep progressing. Versus like, I don't know, maybe some athletes feel like they really have these like big peaks of fitness and then like have to take downtime. I feel like I have had a pretty linear progression.
Mm-hmm. That's exactly what David said too. A couple more things I'd love to ask you about before we wrap up with our closing question. You've done Western States in the past, but like you're going to be in the conversation with the key contenders this year. I wonder how that makes you feel. Like, or does that make you comfortable? And also like, I guess we could come back to your habit of setting extremely high expectations of yourself or extremely big goals, so maybe take those two individually. What are your goals going in? Are you going to be aiming at Courtney Dauwalter's course records? And what does it feel like to you to be among that conversation of the potential winners?
Yeah, I would like to be targeting Courtney's course record. Like whether that's realistic or not, I don't know. That's also partially weather dependent, but like I said, absurd goals. You just set them and see what happens.
Hell yeah.
And I love being in this sport, and I feel like I've been doing this so long, and my life just like these wins are great. They're very exciting in the moment, but also my life is kind of the same. Like I have friends that I love, my cats that I love, like the day to day doesn't change that much. And so I think I'm excited to be in that mix, in that conversation for Western States, but that doesn't change anything in my mindset. Like I still, I do my runs, I get my work done, like I live my life and see what happens when you show up on a big starting line.
Awesome. Well, it's going to be super fun to watch. The last thing I'd like to ask you about is something that Ellie said to me earlier, and you can pass if it's indelicate, but one of the conversations coming out of Black Canyon was that Riley's not sponsored, right? And Ellie made the comment to me that you've had opportunities and that you've intentionally maintained your independence and waited for the right opportunity to present itself. So maybe you could just explain kind of your philosophy as it relates to sponsorship in general. And then, if there's anything you can share about how things might be moving in the background without revealing too much. I'm sure people would be interested.
Yeah. So I've had small opportunities in the past, and I think I've been pretty clear in saying like the sponsorship needs to meaningfully support my ability to train and race and, show up at these events. Not just because I'm not just out there for me to try and get the biggest contract I can. That's not what I'm about. But I do think athletes should be contributing to the sport and not allowing this low bar to be set. Like the more athletes who are like, oh yeah, I'll just take the free gear, that makes it easier for companies to lowball everyone. And so I feel like you kind of have an obligation to the sport to raise the bar for everyone if you are in a position to do so. So that's been some of my thinking behind it. I mean, also I want to care about the gear. Like it needs to work for me. Like I have to be able to run 100 miles in this stuff. Like I can't, there are some people who can wear anything and be fine. And I'm not one of those people, unfortunately.
Yeah.
So I feel like if I'm going to be representing something, it needs to be something that I really can use.
Yeah.
And I'm not being untrue. So yes, waiting for the right sponsorship opportunity. I'm really hoping there'll be some good things coming down the line. But as of now, still free agenting. Yeah.
No way. Come on. There's got to be some conversations happening. You don't need to reveal any more than that, but it would be awesome to see you supported in that way. But I got to say, it would kind of be sad to not see that iconic gray Trails Collective shirt that you've been rocking for years.
I love that
your
shirt.
trademark. Come on. That's Riley Brady.
Yeah.
What is that, by the way? What even is the Trails Collective?
So I don't know if you know Ian Golden. He's
the RD of Cayuga. Yeah.
Yeah. And several other East Coast races. So he started I guess it was a podcast, and I think he was trying to go beyond that with the Trails Collective. And yeah, he gave me one of the shirts to rep it, and I just really like the shirt. It just fits me really well. It's a light color, so in hot temperatures, it's good.
Yeah.
And, you know, always happy to rep Ian's stuff. Like, I just think the world of Ian, and he puts on great races on the East Coast. And so, yeah, if I can support friends and other people trying to like build up the trail community, like, yeah, happy to do that.
Stalwart of the East Coast trail community. Is his outfit's called Red Newt Racing? Is that right?
Yes.
Yeah. And he owns the running store in Ithaca, right?
Yep.
What's that called?
Oh, it might just be like the Ithaca running store or something like that.
Just want to make sure we're giving Ian proper shout outs here.
Yes.
But he's probably in the background like, I hope Riley doesn't get sponsored, because they're really pumping up my podcast here. Anyway.
No, Ian's like, he texts me after the races and is like, sponsorship news, like, let's hear it.
Yeah, cool.
He's a good person, good RD, just good person in the trail community.
Awesome. Well, Riley, it's so fun to have a chance to just sit and chat and get to know you a little bit more. I end all these conversations with the same closing question. That is just, who is one person that you admire? Can be inside or outside of sports, living or dead. Why do you admire that person?
Yeah, one person here. That's really tough to pick. But I think right now I've really been looking up to Sabrina Little. For people who don't know, like, she was a absolute crusher in the trail and I think like 24-hour scene a few years back. She's a philosopher, and I just think her writing on running and philosophy is so good. I read her entire blog when I was growing up in this sport. I still read everything she writes, and it really helps me kind of think about sport in the context of the world more broadly, and, you know, how to be a good person through trail running. So if you don't know about Sabrina Little, I think you should check her out. She's a really cool person.
Oh, what a great answer. And I totally agree. Sabrina is a columnist for Iron Far, and whenever she publishes, it is definitely must-read material. I have not read her book yet, but she published a book, I think, last year called The Examined Run, which I think is the collision of running and philosophy. So I got to get around to that. But shout out to Sabrina Little, and a great contribution to the who do you admire question here from Riley Brady. Well, Riley, thanks again for doing this. Congratulations. You know, these last couple months have probably been sort of surreal for you. I hope you've had a chance to kind of reflect and enjoy this amazing success. And I'm sure there's going to be a lot of people who are really rooting for you in June at Western States. I guess maybe we'll see each other at Canyons.
Yeah. Thanks so much, Dylan.